weakening of the fortunes of the West, the strengthening that's taking place elsewhere, is part of what I would call a global turn.
With the developing world enjoying unprecedented economic growth and the West struggling with debt, declining influence and political dysfunction, are we witnessing a historic shift in the global balance of power? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C., and this is The Heat. It's been a remarkable run. From the 18th century through World War II, it was Europe that guided Western nations to a position of global dominance by spreading liberal democracy and capitalism. After the war, the United States assumed that leadership. Fast forward to today, and a time when Western economies are faced with huge debt, slow growth, political gridlock, and a seeming inability to influence outcomes from Ukraine to Iraq to the South China Sea. And then there's this from the investment firm Goldman Sachs, which says by 2050, 4 of the top 5 economies will come from the developing world: China, India, Brazil, and Russia, with the United States ranked second, about half the size of China. So what does all this say about declining Western influence and the rise of the East and beyond? Later, we'll talk to the co-author of a new book on the subject, but we begin with some perspective and a bit of history from CCTV's Nathan King.
It was a moment of triumph for the West. Fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of communism in Russia and Eastern Europe, widely seen as a triumph of democracy and free markets. Historians argued the ideological and economic battles of the past 500 years were settled. The end of history. The future would be forever shaped by Western values. In the 1990s, the West intervened in Kosovo, Iraq and Somalia. NATO expanded. The influence of Wall Street banks was felt around the world. Then came 9/11, the war on terror, a civil war in Iraq, the counterinsurgency in Afghanistan and the Arab Spring uprisings from Tunisia to Syria. There were also the so-called color revolutions in the Balkans and the former Soviet republics of Georgia, Kyrgyzstan and Ukraine. And a crisis in capitalism was spawned by the collapse of credit, which in turn led to the fall of some of the biggest names in banking, and millions lost their jobs and their homes. Libya imploded after Western intervention in 2011. Syria descended into chaos. Some historians believe the influence of Western liberalism, both economic and political, is now far less assured.
They've lost a lot of prestige. You see these polls taken every year. For example, which government in the world do you think is the greatest threat to peace? And year after year, the U.S. is #1, and there's no one even a close second. Not even a close second. They've lost a lot of their psychological power. The world has seen through their stories much more than before.
US President Barack Obama campaigned to end wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, solve the financial crisis at home, and provide for Americans first. With 2 years left in his second term, Bloom says it has not turned out exactly the way he planned.
His foreign policy, to me, is totally indistinguishable from that of George W. Bush. Totally. In fact, in some ways, it's worse. He has bombed 7 countries.
But for supporters of American exceptionalism, they say even though Western ideas and economics may have taken a battering, they should not be written off just yet.
There are serious problems that the U.S. faces and isn't necessarily solving. What people are missing is the gap between the U.S. and everyone else is gigantic. And so even in the case where the U.S. doesn't address its problems and another country like China potentially does climb up the ladder, they have a long way to go.
But what about the economic philosophy that the U.S. stands for? According to the IMF, the U.S. economy is set to still be one of the world's most dominant for the next 50 years. However, in a recent report by The Economist on the future of the global economy, it shows that capitalism is changing. It concludes that the technological revolution is making it harder for developing economies to catch up, to find jobs for the millions of people moving into cities and finding work. And less industrialization and higher property prices are slowing development.
And I believe that is the right decision.
Then there is the fatigue question of US power. Mr. Obama told graduating military cadets at West Point Academy in May that there are limits to US military power and the ability to solve all the world's problems.
If the U.S. just decides we're tired, we're not interested in going and being involved in the world anymore economically or militarily or both, then that model, which has had an example out there as a positive thing and has had an enforcer out there as a negative thing, that's automatically going to fade. The world's liberal trading system exists because of the United States. If the U.S. stops being a liberal trading country, there's no more world liberal trading system, even if the U.S. is the most powerful country in the world.
And the ground zero right now for this test of Western ideas is often cited as Ukraine, geographically on the edge of West and East. And despite huge amounts of diplomatic, economic and other pressures from both sides, it's clear the country is divided about the model for its future. The idea that one model fits all and that Western liberalism is the panacea for the world's problems, while not wholly disproved entirely, is certainly being challenged from Kiev to Kobani. Back to you, Anand.
Thanks, Nathan. That's CCTV's Nathan King with that report.